they've lost around 940,000 soldiers, either to death or disability, 11,000 tanks, 45,000 vehicles. I mean, not to mention $300 billion of foreign exchange reserves being frozen abroad and other terrible things from their perspective. None of these things would be acceptable in any type of situation where the leader was accountable in any way. So Putin is an unaccountable leader. He's not worried about the people, the voters of Russia. He's not worried about the parliament. He's not worried about the press. He's not worried about the laws. He's totally unaccountable. He can carry on running his country into the ground for a lot longer, as long as he's able to keep his grip on power.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today we're talking to Sir William Browder, who's the CEO of Hermitage Capital, the head of the global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, and I think your last book, you're author of Red Notice and Freezing Order, and that was back in April 2022. Sir William, Bill, welcome back to Frontline.
Great to be here.
Now, a lot's happened, I think, since we've had you last on. A lot seems to happen on a daily basis. Putin seems no closer to accepting any form of ceasefire, never mind a peace plan for Ukraine. His daily attacks are becoming more intense. Donald Trump, when asked about Putin attacking civilian infrastructure and killing families, says it's some sort of mistake. And last night, Trump talked about Zelensky's offer to buy additional Patriot air defense capability, dismissing it and accusing Zelensky of starting the war. What's Trump's game and what's Putin's game in all of this?
Well, let's start with Putin. The reason why Putin started this war in the first place, and let's be clear, it was Putin that started the war. I don't think anyone debates that other than Donald Trump. The reason that Putin started this war is that he needed something in order to stay in power. Putin has been a kleptocrat dictator for 25 years. He's stolen an absolutely ungodly amount of money from the Russian people. I would say that he and the 1,000 people around him over 25 years have stolen $1 trillion from the Russian state. He's terrified that the Russian people at some point will rise up and say enough is enough. And if they rise up, there's no happy ending for Vladimir Putin. So as a dictator, he's taken the step that many dictators take when they're worried about their own people coming against them, which is he found a foreign enemy, he created a foreign enemy, and he started a war. And I should point out that there was actually no beef between the Russians and the Ukrainians before Putin manufactured it. He created a fake conflict. And as a result, this war has nothing to do with NATO. It has nothing to do with his grand vision of a Russian empire. This is purely a little man who's stolen too much money, who wants to stay in power. And so his game plan is to be at war. He needs this war to stay in power. And therefore, it doesn't matter what Donald Trump or anyone else were to offer him. Donald Trump can offer him the 5 oblasts and no NATO and all of this kind of stuff, and it wouldn't make any difference. Not that anyone should offer Putin anything. And therefore, the situation we're in right now is Putin not having altered for 1 minute his objectives in 1 centimeter from when he started this whole thing. And then we also have this crazy American leader who's made all these promises that he can't keep, and he just keeps on repeating over and over again nonsense in order to try to look like he's the deal maker that's going to solve this whole problem.
Yes, but Putin's lost his strategic objective. He failed to take Kyiv. He failed to topple the Zelensky government. He failed to install a puppet government inside Russia. And he's gone for this secondary objective of the Donbass and getting that. And he's even failed to capture that. Is there a real threat, though, to Putin's position inside Moscow? And if there is, who are the main players that would potentially be threatening him or lining themselves up to take over from him?
Well, he's trying to do everything possible to prevent any threat of anybody taking over. But you remember, it was in the summer of 2023, just out of nowhere came Yevgeny Prigozhin, one of his warriors, who was so angry at the way he was executing the war that he ended up turning on his own people, and of course that ended up in his being murdered. But That's the kind of thing that could happen, and there's no telling where that would come from. Of course, that was one threat that Putin was able to extinguish, but he doesn't know where the next threat is going to come from, and that's the problem with being a dictator. And it used to be when he was sort of, I would call, a mild dictator, he would have some carrots as well as some sticks, but he's run out of carrots. He has no carrots left. He's now fully on the stick mode. And that's a much harder position to maintain when you're just beating people down because you don't know where the next one's going to pop up. And that's his real problem right now.
So, do you think he's actually running scared, and therefore the war is something that will continue no matter what? And within that, where do the likes of is it Dmitriev, who he's got now going into the United States and trying to negotiate with whoever Donald Trump brings up, because Donald Trump seems to be throwing lots of different people at his international diplomacy. We've got Witkoff, who's the front man now. Marcus Rubio seems to be sitting there in the background doing very little. JD Vance jumps up and down every now and again in the Oval Office and starts doing things that are outside or have been outside any of the other vice presidents' remits. Where does Dmitriev and the other Russian interlocutors fit into this?
Well, so the basic plan from Putin's side is to carry on. He's doing so in the context of Trump making this promise to the American people of ending the war. And so the best way for Putin to carry on is to carry on and then throw all sorts of other things at the Americans in the form of negotiations or discussions or some business interactions in order to keep the conversation going, to continue to appear as if there's some type of peace negotiations going on. And that's where this guy Kirill Dmitriev fits in. He shows up. He says, "Well, I'm not really the warrior guy. I'm just the business guy. But why don't we do some business together?" And you had Marco Rubio speaking with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and they discussed reestablishing people in the U.S. embassy in Moscow and the Russian embassy in Washington. And you have all sorts of what non-peace negotiations going on. And so as long as you don't look at the substance, which is, has Putin agreed to a ceasefire? No. But as long as you don't look at that, it looks like there's something going on. And that's better than a total, black, white, 1-0 binary negative outcome for Donald Trump when he said he was going to bring peace in this situation.
So, what do you think Putin really thinks of Trump?
Well, I think Putin thinks of Trump the same thing he thought of Biden, the same thing he thought of Obama, the same thing he thought of George Bush, that he is a person to be manipulated, a person to try to use their ego to to help him further his objectives. And I should point out that although everybody is saying that Trump is so pro Putin, everybody else was too. When George Bush first started his presidency, he had a famous meeting in Slovenia with Putin, and he came out of that meeting and said, "I looked into his eyes and I saw his soul." And then for a couple more meetings, there was some goodwill until Putin basically defied him. And then you had Obama, who started out his presidency with the Russian reset. They even had Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, deliver a red reset button to Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. And then you had Trump in his first term, who wanted to be friends with Putin. And then you had Biden, who, when he first started out, said he wants to create a predictable relationship with Putin. And so all of these guys are in the business of thinking, well, I'm the U.S. president. You don't get to be the U.S. president unless you're pretty special. I'm so special. I can have a personal relationship with Vladimir Putin. He's a troublesome guy. If we have a personal relationship, maybe I can use my charisma to talk him out of being a troublesome guy. And of course, it never works. And we're in that mode right now. Although it's a much more dangerous mode because Putin is at war now. He's at war very close.
Yeah. Well, the other players in the game are it's the UK, the EU, and this coalition of the willing. So if Putin is just playing Donald Trump. What's Putin's view of this, of the EU, of the UK, of the coalition of the willing? And does he see it as a potential threat, or does he see it as this group of countries that he can continue to try and
Well,
divide?
that's the key point, is trying to divide everybody. So Putin, he loves dividing, and he hates big cohesive organizations. So he hates the NATO because that's a group of countries. A lot of little countries he could easily dominate, but if they're all part of one big group, then he can't. He hates the European Union, which is why he was so excited about Brexit, because that was a way of breaking up the European Union. And he hated the United States because the United States was on par with him. And so his objective always is to try to divide and conquer. And it generally works because there's so many different people with so many different interests. And it's worked very well up until in current times, because he's been able to break the United States off from the European Union and from the UK and from Canada and Japan, all the members of the coalition of the willing. And it doesn't completely destroy the opposition to Putin. The European Union, UK, Japan, Canada is a pretty powerful coalition. But taking the US out of the equation takes 40% of all the financial military aid out of the equation. By taking the US out, it gets rid of the huge intelligence resources that come from spy satellites that the US has effectively a monopoly on. Not having the US gets rid of Patriot missile batteries that the Ukrainians can use to shoot down enemy attacks when they're bombing civilians. And so there's a lot of things that the US does that if they don't do, it's very problematic for Ukraine. But that doesn't mean that the European Union and the UK and others can't provide a credible deterrent to Russia. As I said, it was only the US does 40%. UK, Europe, and others do 60% of the financial aid. And if necessary, there's $300 billion of Russian money sitting in the custody of the UK and the EU that can be confiscated and used for the Ukrainians' defense. And so it would be ridiculous to think that Putin can somehow, he's more powerful than the EU and the UK. I mean, he can't even win against Ukraine by himself. And if you add up all the assets, resources, and so on of the EU, we're talking about a force much, much larger than Russia's. And so we have the ability to hold Putin back, but it does require us to recognize that we're in a whole new world. We're in a world where Donald Trump and the United States used to be the anchor of the allies, and now it doesn't participate.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned intelligence. I think that's important, but I think the other bit that's really important is the U.S. defense industrial base that Europe has relied on for too long to supply it, the basics, ammunition, whilst European stocks have been run down. But I agree with you. The Russian economy is what, $2.2 trillion. The EU economy is $200 trillion. The EU should be able to outspend Russia without any problems whatsoever, even if the Americans withdraw. But we see with the Russian economy, 30 to 50% of it over the last decades come from oil revenue. Politico reported in February that the Russian defense expenditure was 6.7% of its GDP. I think it's probably more in 2024. Which was a growth of 40% than beforehand. Will the West outspend Russia and bankrupt it? And especially when we've got the likes of Bodanov's special operations executive type attacks going in to Russian oil infrastructure, to Russian logistic bases, to scaring Russian military commanders, and Russian airfields, and carrying out this operational level, this deep operation. Is that really going to properly hurt Putin? Is that where the war is going to be won or lost?
Well, I think very much so. I mean, it's the Ukrainians have an incredible ability to fight, given how disproportionately weak they are from a financial standpoint. I mean, the Russians have sort of 10 to 1 of the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians are very, very good at using whatever limited resources they have to inflict grave pain on Russia. And as you mentioned, they figured out that if a major part of the Russian economy that finances the war is oil, then you need to decapitate that. And how do you do that? You bomb oil refineries, and they've been bombing them using long distance drones. It's very interesting because 2 days ago, the incoming Chancellor Friedrich Merz has approved the supply of Taurus missiles, which are very long range. I think
Yeah,
can
500 kilometers plus. Yeah,
indeed, and therefore those missiles can be used to attack Russian military infrastructure, and in doing so, it means that the Russians have to pull back their military infrastructure beyond 500 kilometers, which means that it puts the Ukrainians at less risk of being attacked in their civilian capitals. And so all these things are very important. And there's one more thing which is quite interesting, which is that as oil is the mainstay, the lubricant that allows Russia to continue to fight the war, the oil price, because of these tariff wars, has dropped. It's dropped a good 15 to 20%, and we're now talking about around $51 per barrel for Urals, which is the Urals crude, which is the type of oil that Russia sells, and that's far below the level that Russia is comfortable operating at. And if these oil prices were to stay this low for long or go lower, we could end up seeing Russia going into a real economic catastrophe. And if they do that, then Putin is just less able to continue to execute the war the way he's been doing it.
But we're saying Putin at the same time. We've talked of the West's access to the U.S. defense industrial base. Russia's defense industrial base clearly isn't up to it. What level of corruption is there still within that? And we're seeing Russia having to get closer to China, to North Korea, to Iran. And I saw recent estimates that up to 80% of Russia's artillery ammunition is coming from North Korea. You're proving that it can't sustain its own manufacturing. And we've got the reports of Chinese soldiers being captured in the front line. And in fact, in a press conference last night run by the Ukrainians, the two Chinese soldiers turned around and said that the Russians had tried to kill them with chemical weapons rather than let them be captured. These are all signs of desperation. Is Putin that desperate? And what do you think Xi Jinping will be getting out of this from Russia? What's the debt that's going to be there, and the likelihood of him then having to call that in at some stage in the future?
Well, I would say that Russia is in a very desperate situation. If you look at the Ukrainian estimates, they've lost around 940,000 soldiers, either to death or disability, 11,000 tanks, 45,000 vehicles. I mean, not to mention $300 billion of foreign exchange reserves being frozen abroad and other terrible things from their perspective. None of these things would be acceptable in any type of situation where the leader was accountable in any way. So Putin is an unaccountable leader. He's not worried about the people, the voters of Russia. He's not worried about the parliament. He's not worried about the press. He's not worried about the laws. He's totally unaccountable. And therefore, even though he's in a desperate situation and the losses that they've incurred are completely, in a democratic country, we couldn't have sustained 1/100th of their losses without the people kicking out the leader. But he can carry on running his country into the ground for a lot longer, as long as he's able to keep his grip on power. And so far, he's been able to do that. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be some totally unexpected moment where it all comes undone. But we can't bank on that. We can't predict that. And we can't operate and make our plans on that basis, because that might never happen. Look at North Korea. The Kim family has been around for 3 generations. And so, sometimes dictators fall and sometimes they don't. As far as China is concerned, China is loving this. They're just licking their lips right now. They're getting cheap oil. The Russians have to sell them oil at a discount. They're getting markets that the Westerners have stopped selling into. You can't buy an iPhone in Moscow, and so the Chinese are selling their phones in and their cars and all this kind of stuff. And perhaps most of all, China, who is an enemy of democracy, is watching all these democracies having to dig deep into their pockets and expend valuable resources helping the Ukrainians. And the Chinese can just sit there and smile as the dictatorships, score a point and the democracies have to lose a point.
Do you think the Chinese are manipulating the Russians to try and create instability, to take focus away from what they're doing in Southeast Asia? And do you think China is actually, in the same way they have done through Africa, um, effectively buying big chunks of Russia, buying chunks of Russian natural resources that, if there is a collapse of the Russian Federation, China will then want to go and protect?
Well, it's just up. It's only upside for China. That the whole situation of Russia at war. If it doesn't go well for Russia, China can hoover up the pieces. If it goes well for Russia, it's a win for dictatorships. In the meantime, there's all sorts of money to be made, and just like with Africa, they don't have to expend any valuable resources of their own, and they end up with all sorts of influence that they're getting that we're not. And so this is definitely a win for China, except if Ukraine were to prevail. If Ukraine prevails, then it looks pretty terrible for China in their ambitions to take over Taiwan. And so, the only thing that they're scared about is the West cohesive enough so that it would respond robustly if they were to go after Taiwan. And so this is kind of a litmus test for the Chinese to see how we're behaving towards Ukraine. And of course, if the United States abandons Ukraine, that's a good sign for China going after Taiwan.
Yep. Well, it's fascinating, but surely there must be across Russia, with the different elements of the federation, and with I don't know what you'd have as a slightly tongue-in-cheek collective noun for the oligarchs that are running the country. There must be something there, but they must be sitting very unhappy that their way of life that they used to know before sanctions came in, before this invasion of Ukraine, has now been destroyed completely, and their families must be putting pressure on them as well. And then you've got the leaders of the different elements of the federation. They must be sitting going, well, Moscow is losing its grip. Maybe this is an opportunity for us to get greater autonomy. Are you picking up anything that is causing or would cause Putin that sort of angst?
Well, he's always scared of someone coming for him, and it's not so much grumbling, specific grumbling, but it's more the fact that whoever runs Russia, it becomes richer than the king of Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's the money is so good that everybody wants that job. Everyone wants to take it away from him. Everyone wants those resources, and so the problem he has and he's always had is that it's a pretty profitable position to be in, to be the president of Russia. Putin's probably the richest man in the world, and lots of other people would like to be the richest man in the world if they could be. And therefore, he's extremely paranoid, and he's rightly paranoid because there are people who want to take his job and his resources, and therefore he's looking out in every possible way to either kill, imprison, or disappear anybody who's going to challenge him. And of course, we've seen lots of examples of that. There's Alexei Navalny, the famous opposition activist who was killed in February 2024 in prison. There was Boris Nemtsov. There was Yevgeny Prigozhin. And of course, there's probably hundreds of others whose names you don't recognize, but were real threats to Putin. So any oligarch who's grumbling about not having enough money, he's grumbling to himself. Maybe not even grumbling to himself because they're so scared. These guys are so scared that at any point it could all be taken away and they could end up dying, that they're just keeping their nose clean, their head down, and just doing whatever they're told to do.
Yes, we keep hearing of oligarchs taking up window cleaning jobs and then having small accidents off the ninth floor or falling down the stairs. But do you think that if there was a real move against Putin, the power play, because there doesn't seem to be a natural successor, the power play could lead to the potential breakup of the Russian Federation?
Well, this is the myth that Putin likes to put out there, that he's the only guy holding it all together, and therefore the Russians need him. And even if they don't like him, he's better than the alternative. Um, who knows what will happen? I guess what I would say is that the spin that he puts out there that he may be bad, but he's better than the alternative is nonsense. This is a guy who's threatening the West with nuclear war. This is a person who's started the first change of boundaries and borders since the Second World War in Europe. This is a guy who's killed 1 million of his own young men. He's a guy who's killed numerous, hundreds of thousands of civilians in Ukraine, not to mention all the civilians killed in Syria and Chechnya and Georgia. He's a true menace to the world, and so I don't think we should be spending our time trying to predict, all the terrible scenarios of what would happen if Putin wasn't in power. I think we should just do everything possible to contain him and hope that somewhere inside Russia the opposition comes and replaces him.
Now, there was a phone call between Trump and Putin, where everyone focused on what he was talking about with Zelensky, but there was a very small element to it where Trump turned around to Putin and said, "Don't you give Iran the capability to destroy Israel?" Do you think Putin was seriously thinking of giving nuclear capability to Iran? Do you think that the CRINC countries are coming together from a military perspective in a way that we should be slightly more worried about?
Well, I think that, I mean, if you look at it, so Russia is in a very isolated place, very isolated. And they're in a place where they, as you mentioned earlier in our conversation, they're running out of weapons, that they can't produce them themselves. And so they're becoming very, very dependent on North Korea, very dependent on Iran, very dependent on China. And certainly North Korea and Iran are very desperate to develop their nuclear weapons capabilities. And so there is leverage that they have over Putin. Now, do they have enough leverage for him to do that? Hard to say, hard to know, but that's a very serious risk of nuclear proliferation.
Do you think the risk was more global? Because we've seen America and Russia fail to live up to the Budapest Memorandum. Arguably, if Ukraine had retained the old Soviet nuclear weapons that it had on its soil, Russia may not have invaded. The UK didn't live up to the Budapest Memorandum in 2014 when Russia took Crimea, and therefore international agreements and security guarantees on paper are worthless. Do you think we're on the brink of seeing a global nuclear arms race where lots of little countries are going to say the only way of protecting ourselves is to get nuclear weapons?
Definitely. Here we are, where the United States provided the nuclear security umbrella for Europe, and they've effectively said that they may not be in place. And so Germany is saying, okay, well, how do I get some nukes? They're talking to the French and the UK. Poland wants in. Everybody wants in. And so I can't imagine a scenario where there's not a nuclear arms race, because it's just becoming such a fractious, individualistic, dangerous world for every country. And I would say it's more the fault of the recent actions by the U.S. administration than it is by the Budapest Memorandum. I don't think, nobody's really been talking about the Budapest Memorandum as the impetus to develop nuclear weapons, but any idea that NATO is not going to function definitely gets everybody, at least in the Western world, wanting to develop their own nuclear deterrent.
So, two quick questions to finish, I think. Is a larger war in Europe inevitable?
Well, I think no. I think that Europe is probably the bastion of hope for the world. Europe is a place that can step up right now and create a solid democracy, freedom-based military umbrella for all members, and to be a member and to be part of that military umbrella protects you. It becomes sort of the substitution of NATO, and I think that in that case, it creates a real incentive not to have wars in Europe.
So I said two. It's going to be three, because I have to ask you a follow up on that. Given that, how do we stop Putin? How do we make Putin sit up and recognize that what he has to do is withdraw from Ukraine and go back and try and get Russia into the global world order again after a time of penance for what he's done?
Well, I don't think Putin is ever going to want to join the world order. He likes the world mafia situation better than the world order. But the way you get Putin to back down is to force him to. And what does that mean? That means putting him in a position where he has no choice but to concede. And how do you do that? You do it militarily. You give the Ukrainians everything that they've been asking for so that they can take care of the job. They've got their own reasons for doing this. And so it's really, they're happy they're happy to fight off the Russians. Well, not happy. They desperately need to fight off the Russians, but in order to do that, they have to have the weapons, and that's where we can come in and help them. And if they do have the weapons, then they could potentially put Putin in a position where they have the boot on his throat, and then he'll negotiate. But he's not going to negotiate until then.
Yeah, and we can help destroy Russia economically through other means as well. My final question is, are we in a path to global conflict? Do you think? Do you think Xi Jinping is sitting watching what's going on, and we'll see an optimal time in this to go for Taiwan or something else? And given the international sanctions that there are, or the sanctions from the United States onto China, are we in a sort of 1940, 1941 economic pressure on Japan moment?
Well, it kind of feels that way. You've got Russia invading Ukraine. You've got China eyeing up Taiwan. You've got the United States, withdrawing from all of its previous relationships, alliances, et cetera, that threatening Greenland, Panama, Canada. It all feels very awful at the moment. Hopefully the cooler heads prevail, but it does feel a bit. I wasn't alive in the 1930s, but I imagine that this is what it must have felt like as we were going into World War II. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope that cooler heads prevail, but it all feels a bit uncertain and scary right now.
Well, yes, I have to agree with you, unfortunately. But Sir William Browder, thank you very much indeed for talking to us today on Frontline.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching another episode of Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you want more great content, please sign up for Times Radio membership, and then you can leave comments and ask questions, which we'll endeavour to answer in other shows. And if you want to be kept up to date with day-to-day events, please tune into Times Radio. Thank you.